Hello there, welcome back. Good to see you back again. So, in this session, we'll be focusing on creating an HTML form and asking the user to enter the data using an HTML form. And now we'll take this data and update this data to a MySQL database using PHP. So, our focus is on getting data through an HTML form and updating the data or inserting that data as a record in MySQL database using PHP. In the last session, we have seen how to open database connection, how to insert, update, delete, select records from within PHP. But now we are going one step ahead. We are going to get the data through the form and update that data into the database. So before coming to this lecture, please visit my previous lecture on PHP database connectivity with MySQL databases so that you'll be able to understand this better. So this session is all about these things, that is creating an HTML form, getting the data, and updating the MySQL database using PHP. So what is the data that we are going to get from the user using an HTML form? So here I have my MySQL database up and running. I'm using this database called Satish. Inside the database, I have this table called employee. So we are going to get the following data from the user: employee ID, name, phone number, salary, date, and address. So the user will be entering this data using an HTML form and we'll be updating that inside our table here. So let's get to the form. Let's create this simple HTML page. Let's say this is PHP database demo, and we'll create a simple form. We're not going to have any JavaScript validations here. We'll just get the data directly into a PHP code and open a connection to the database server and insert it. If you're interested in having any JavaScript validations, then you can refer to my previous lecture and include that code as part of this demonstration. So here form will have the action to be, we're going to have the PHP code in the same form. So we're going to refer to this same form. I'll call this test.php. Method, we are submitting data, so we'll always use post. And on submit, as I told you, we're not going to have any JavaScript validation here. I'll directly give return true. You can write a method and then perform the validations. Our focus is not on JavaScript validations. Our focus is on inserting the data into the database. Now let's create this simple form. Let's have a label. Label is for employee ID. We'll ask the user to enter his employee ID. And the input type here is text. We'll have a name field. Name is employee ID. ID also we can have, if you're working with JavaScript, we'll have the ID to be employee ID. It's required for this user to enter this. So it's a mandatory field. We'll have a break. So this is all about asking the user to enter his employee ID. We have created an input type to be text, name and ID field. Let me replicate this. For the user to enter his name, we'll just change the label as name here. We'll call that username. Enter your name, and the name field we can say it's username, and ID is also username. So we have created an input of type text for the user to enter his username. Next, we'll ask the user to enter his phone number. Again, let me replicate this, and we are going to have this label for phone numbers. He's going to enter his phone number. So enter your phone number. And the name, we can have it to be phone, ID also to be phone. The next field we're going to ask the user to enter is salary. Let me again replicate this. So he's going to enter his salary here. So salary, enter your salary. Input type is text, name will be salary, ID will be salary. We'll ask the user to enter his joining date here. So here the input type will be date. So in label for We'll call this join date. Enter your or select your joining date because its input type is date. Select your joining date, and input type here is date. Name will be join date. If you are going to validate this using JavaScript, you can also have an ID. We'll call that join date. Finally, we'll ask the user to enter his address. So let me replicate this. So address will be the last field he is entering. Let me copy paste it here. So this is a label for address. Enter your address. So the name is address and the the ID is address. Finally, you'll have the submit button, input type to be submit. We have to have a name field. Name is submit, and value will have value to be submit. Okay, we have completed our HTML form. Let's see how the form looks. Output is like this. So employee will be entering his ID, name, phone number, salary, and address, and he'll also be selecting his joining date and submitting. The objective is we should have the data in PHP and then establish a connection to the MySQL database and insert this data into a table on the MySQL database. So we'll capture this data in PHP. Let's write the PHP code. Let me put my PHP code here. The first thing we are going to check is whether the user has submitted the form. So we'll call this function is set, and then we'll use this super global variable post and give the name of the submit button here. So if the user has submitted the form, then we'll get all the data entered by the user. We'll get the employee ID. For this, we'll access the super global variable post and then give the name field for employee ID, that is EID. The same way, we'll also get username. We'll call this username, and the name field for username is username. Next, we have phone number. For phone number, the name we have given in the form is phone. So we give the field as phone. For salary, again, $_post salary. So whatever value that the user enters using the text box, that will be populated as $salary in PHP. Next, we'll check the join date. So join date, again, we are going to access that using the super global variable post, and then we give this join date as the variable, and we'll also get in the address. So it is $address. So it's $address and $_post. It's what is the value for the name field we have given? It's address. So we populate that here, address. So we are getting all the input entered by the user inside our PHP script. Next, what we are going to do is we are going to open a connection to the database and close the connection. So we're going to write some functions for opening and closing connection. So this is a function for opening connection to the database, and we'll call this function to be open connection. What we are going to have in this function is we'll have the DB host. What is the DB host we are going to have? It's local host, where we have hosted our DB server. It's on the local host, and we have other parameters like DB user, and there's no DB password. So we'll have DB user here. User is root, and DB, the database we are going to connect to is, I've created a database with my name Satish. So that's the database. And we'll create this object of type mysqli. You pass the parameters to the constructor. What all parameters you're going to pass? DB host, and then the username db user, and there's no password. I have no password set for my database, so I'm not giving anything there. And the final parameter is database name. Or if there is any connection issues, we can just die with the script, that is connection failed, and we can display the connection error. This function will return the connection object once the connection is established. So this is the function. It's for opening a connection with the DB. It will create an object of type MySQLi, return that object, and we are passing the parameters like host name, username, and database name to the function. We'll write another function for closing connection. And I'm sorry. So what we are going to have here is we're just going to get this connection object, whatever connection object it is, and we are going to call this method close from the MySQLi object. So it's $connection, and we'll close the connection. A very simple method for closing the connection, just calling close method from the MySQLi object. Now comes the actual code wherein we'll open a connection by calling this function. So this is going to return a connection object when I call open connection. So this returns the MySQLi object, which is the connection object. We can even echo a message saying connection, just for a reference. Connection established successfully. And we can concatenate that with break tags. We'll now insert the values into the database. For this, we should write our insert query. Let's write our insert query as the string represented with the variable $SQL, and the insert query is insert into employee values. So what values we are going to insert is the values that we have received in these variables: employee ID, username, phone, salary, join date, and address. So we're just going to give the parameters like this, that is in single quotes $employee underscore ID. That is the first parameter. The next parameter is name, so it is $username. So you give every parameter within quotes: $username, comma, and then the next parameter is $phone number. So it's phone number that we are getting in. The next parameter is salary, so it's $salary, and the next parameter is $join date. So you have to give that in quotes, so don't forget the quotes. And the final parameter is address, $address. So that's our insert query, close the parenthesis, semicolon. So we have completed our insert query. The only thing is we are getting these values from the user using a form, and we are populating that to the database. Now, how will you insert the data inside your database? You should be calling this method. Say we'll be using the connection object and calling this specific method, query method, passing the SQL string. And if this returns true, then our insert to the database is successful. So we'll be checking this. And if that is fine, if it returns true, we can say record inserted successfully in the database. If it returns a false, we can say echo record insert error, and then we'll populate the error using this attribute from the MySQLi object. Finally, we'll call this close connection, and then we'll pass our connection object. So what is that we have done here? We have received the data entered by the user inside PHP, and then we have established two functions, one for opening a connection, which returns a connection object, one for closing a connection, which gets the connection object and closes the connection. So we have opened this connection, received this object, We have mentioned the query. So inside the query, we have populated the variables which hold our data, and we have called this query method from the connection object, pass the query as a string. If it returns true after the execution of the query on the database, a record is inserted successfully in the database. Else, we say record insert error and populate the error to the user. Finally, we close the connection. So we'll see whether our data insert is fine. So this parenthesis we'll remove. We'll execute this code. Let's check whether this is working. So we'll enter the employee ID to be 12460. We don't have that employee ID, and we'll enter the name as Mohan, and other data will enter. So employee ID is 12460, name is Mohan. Enter phone numbers, some phone numbers will enter. Salary, say 25,000, like that. And we'll select a date here. We'll select a date and address US. So let's submit. Connection established successfully, record inserted successfully in the database. So record has been inserted. Let's check our database. Select star from employee. So here is our record 12460 Mohan and the other data pertaining to Mohan. So that's how you create a PHP form that gets the data from the user and then establishes a connection with the MySQL database and updates or inserts the record into the database. I hope you were able to follow this concept. So we have seen how to insert and record into the database by getting the data from the user through an HTML form. But there's an issue with this particular way of inserting data. We are getting the data and directly populating it to our SQL query. So this can lead to SQL injection attacks. So to avoid this, what we'll do is we will try and see the use of prepared statements using PHP. So we're going to insert data using prepare statement in PHP, or else we can say we are going to use the prepare method for inserting records into the database. Let's take a look at that. So what will be the changes that we are going to make to our execution of a query is, instead of just directly passing the data in our query here, what we'll perform here is we'll give question marks. So instead of manipulating it like this, we are going to give question marks in our SQL query. So it's going to be a question mark here and question mark here. So wherever you have the attributes, don't pass it directly to the query. Give a question mark for every attribute. So this is the question mark and this is the question mark. And that's our query. And now we are not going to use query and pass the SQL string. We are going to use a different method here. The method that we are going to use is, it's of the MySQL object. It's present in the MySQL object and the method name is prepare, and we'll pass our query string here $SQL. And what this returns is, it returns as an object of type statement. So we'll capture that object $statement. So $statement is the object that is getting returned, and we'll be accessing some methods of the $statement for binding parameters and executing the query. Say we'll be calling this method from the statement object $statement. We'll call bind param. So bind param is going to be the method that is a method inside your statement object. So this prepare method actually returns a statement object, and we are going to use the statement object to bind parameters. The very first statement or the very first argument in your bind parameters is, what is the data type for all the data that is getting populated in your database. So the first one is employee ID, which is a string. So you say that's yes. Again, name is a string, phone number is a string, salary is an integer, you mention that as an I, date we'll say it's a string, and then finally address is a string. So we should mention the data types for all your parameters. That is the first argument. And then you're going to pass all the arguments: employee ID, username, phone, salary, join date, everything as part of this query. So you're going to just give dollar employee ID, dollar name, username, dollar phone number, dollar the next parameter is dollar salary, dollar join date, and dollar address. So you're binding the parameters. So these are the parameters that will be taking up the places in the question marks in your query. After binding the parameters, we'll call the execute method of our statement object. So it's statement execute. That's it. So this is going to execute the query on your database, and we can give a message to the user saying echo record inserted successfully in the database. So that's how you use the prepare statement here. That is, you're going to call the prepare method from your connection object, that's the MySQL object, pass the query string. So in your query, you're not going to directly populate the values. We are going to give a question mark for all the attributes that we are passing, and it returns a statement object, and we need to execute bind parameter method from the statement object. And here the parameters will be, the first parameter will tell us the data types for your arguments, and the next will be binding every parameter like employee ID, username, phone, salary, join date, address in the order that is given in the query. And then we'll execute this by calling the execute method of the statement object. And finally, we'll close the connection. Let's check whether our code works fine. So this is the test.php. This is the form. Let's enter some data here. 12461 to be the ID. Name to be Jeff. Phone number, let's enter some phone number. Salary, some 2000. Let's select a date. The date, we'll select some date, and address we'll say Pune. Let's submit it. Okay, there's an issue. Okay, there's an issue here. The issue is we should not give the question marks in quotes. I forgot to remove the question marks. I forgot to remove the quotes. So let's remove the quotes. We are just saying there's a parameter that's coming here that we are going to pass. So it should not be inside quotes. So that's what I think is the issue here. Let me again try and run this. Say employee ID is 12461. And name is Jeff. Phone number is some phone numbers we'll enter. Salary is 3000. Some 3500 we'll give. We'll select a date. Date we'll select, and address we'll say is from Pune. Now we'll submit. So connection established successfully, record inserted successfully in the database. Let's check. Select star from employee. So you're able to see the record that we have inserted just now. So understand here, so in order to avoid SQL injection issues, we can go with the use of statement object and prepare methods. We are writing the SQL query. Instead of passing the data directly in the SQL query, we are mentioning each argument as a question mark. And we are calling the prepare method of MySQL object. And then we are passing this query string. Now this one returns a statement object. And how is that you bind parameters to these question marks? We use bind underscore param method, which is present in the statement object. And this method, the very first argument, tells us the data type for all the arguments we are passing. So employee ID is a string, name is a string, and we have phone number to be a string. Salary is an integer, so it's I, and date is a string, and address is a string. And then you map all the data that's coming in: employee ID, username, phone, salary, join date, that we are receiving, and we execute the query by calling the execute method of the statement object. Finally, the record gets inserted. So that's how you can use prepared statements in PHP. I hope you were able to follow this. Now let us take a look at the next concept, that is, how can we select data from a table? Say I want to return the data from this table, employee ID and name I want to return, whereas I want to return this data as an HTML table to the user. How to write an HTML table by reading the data from the database. So this is going to be our next activity. Let's start working on that. So what is our next activity? It is selecting a table. It is like select star from employee or select some columns from employee and returning the data in HTML table format. So how you return the data itself as an HTML table to the user so that the presentation looks nice enough. So let's start with this now. So we are going to directly establish a connection with the database and print the data as an HTML table. For this, maybe we'll have a simple form with only a submit button, and the value can be view employee data. So this is the button. When the user clicks on this button, we should establish a connection with the database and bring all the data back. So we'll be checking whether the button has been submitted. And these things are going to remain for every database operation. We are going to establish a connection, close the connection. So we are establishing a connection. And after this, here, we are going to deal with selecting an entire table or selecting some columns of the table. So what we'll perform here is we'll maybe display employee ID and name for all the employees from this table to the user as an HTML table itself. So for this, we are going to change a query. It's not an insert query here. So what is the query? We'll be selecting employee ID, comma name from employee table. So we are just selecting two columns of data. So these two columns will be returned, and we have many rows here. So that is our query, and we'll pass this query to our query function. As usual, it's the query function we are going to call. The query we are going to pass is $SQL. So how will you invoke this method from the MySQL object? Is the connection object, the object operator. So that's how you pass the query, and whatever result that you're going to get here will be handled as an object itself. So $result is an instance of type MySQL underscore result. So this is an object that's coming back when you execute this query on the database, because this query will return rows and columns of data. We've already seen these concepts in my previous lecture. If you're not clear with this, please refer to my previous lecture on PHP database connections. So how to check whether the query actually returns any rows from the table? We have to use this object $result, and there's a parameter num rows from this object, which will check whether it is greater than 0. If it is greater than 0, then we are sure that there are certain rows and columns being returned from the table, and we have to run through every row. We are going to return every row as an associative array. We'll call every row as $row, and we'll use this object, and then the method we are going to use here is fetch associative. So fetch associative array will actually fetch every row as an associative array. So this is what we have seen, and after all our operations are done, we'll also call close connection, and then we'll pass the connection object. There's one more thing here, else. If the number of rows returned is not greater than 0, we can echo no rows found in the table. Now let's come to the main part, that is, we should write an HTML table back to the user with the data that is getting returned from the database. So for that, first we'll echo the table. So we'll write the syntax for the table. So we in HTML start a table with this syntax, right? HTML table, and we'll also enable the border here. Border is equal to 1. And we'll also write the first header row, that is we start and end a row like this in HTML, right? What we need to write here is the header row for our table. Header will have, say we'll have employee ID should be displayed. Let's close the header. And we'll have name. So we are just bringing employee ID and name. We'll close the parenthesis here. So we are writing an HTML table out. That's why we are writing the syntax for a table back to the user. So this is the header for the table. Now we should get each row of data and we should embed that inside this table. So it's like writing every row with the data here. So it's echo, we'll echo the row, that is a row, and how will you end a row? It is /tr. And within each row you're going to have columns, so you'll echo columns here. So that is the start of the first column, and we'll concatenate $row, and then we'll print the employee ID. Then we'll close the column. So we have to close the column. It's a little tedious, but it's quite easy. You're just writing an HTML table out. So this is the first row. So in the first row, this is the first data row. So in the first data row, what we're going to have is we're going to have the first column having the employee ID. So it's an associative array. $row of EID will print the value corresponding to the first employee ID from the table. Now let's print the next column. The next column will be writing the employee name out, and we are going to perform this activity till we reach the end of the table. That's it. And one more thing we should keep in mind, after finishing our while loop, we should also close the table, right? So that is one more thing, we should close this table. Okay, so let's take a look at the output. Let's see whether our data is returned as a table back to the user. Okay, let's see the output. Let's check whether we are getting the output here. So this is the button that's visible to the user. When he clicks on view employee data, now you see an HTML table is getting returned. So this is the header row for the table, and these are the column rows. So we talk about header row. So this is we manage the header row, writing the HTML table out with the header row, employee ID and name. So you're able to see employee ID name written as the header row, and these are the data rows. For each data row, we are using as an associative array. We are embedding that inside an HTML table and writing the data out. So you can also add some styles to your table. You can have it as an external style sheet. Now for the demonstration purpose, I'll include the style here. I'll embed the style in the head section directly, and header of the table, and then we can apply some styling, say background color to be aqua. Let's check whether it is getting reflected. See, we have applied some styles here. Maybe we can also go with other styling like tr and child to n, and we can have a background color to be gray. Let's check whether this is fine. Refresh employee data. So the demonstration that we have seen now is we are establishing a connection with the database, and we are selecting rows and columns of data from the database. We are handling that using the result object. It's an instance of type mysqli underscore result. We are checking whether the number of rows is greater than 0. If we get more number of rows, what we do, we write the table out. That's an HTML table, the header we write. And inside the while loop, we fetch every row from the table that is being returned as an associative array. And we embed the data within the columns of our HTML table. And then after writing every row, we finish our table out. If the number of rows returned is not greater than 0, then we echo the message, no rows found in the table. Finally, after the task is done, we are closing the connection. I hope you were able to follow this concept on how to read data and write the data as an HTML table back to the user.